Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANs processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Oh, I got myself in trouble again. Oh, yes. Let's do it this way. Mark, can you just give me a sound and video check, please?
Yeah, we see your screen and your voice is perfect.
Thank you so much. And again, so welcome to the Keshe American Knowledge Team meeting. We are in the year 2024, and the timestamp is we are in the post-Sanya conference era, where we have seen that there's gold in them, our hills. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We are in the intermediate transition zone. We're going to discuss the North Pole today. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is June 16th, 2024. This is the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So welcome, everybody. This is following up a long series that we started several years ago. And we're in the intermediate portion of it, which was the advancement from the basic portion of it. And we completed the intermediate transmission. Now we're into the intermediate transition. And today's topic being the North Pole. Well, we've kind of discussed that before, but you see, we're still on the hesitancy highway. And we have to understand that this is the lowest energy state. And so, yeah, life is hard. And they say it gets a lot easier when you get up on the horse, but you have to pick the winning horse. And even then, it could be a bumpy ride. So the thing is that you have to exercise caution. You have to keep your balance. And so we're discussing the plasma sciences put forward by Marin Tevakoli Keshe in the 3 books. The book number 1, Universal Order, Creation of Matter. And then the book number 2, The Structure of the Light. And of course, book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, which makes one wonder if book number 3 should be book number 1. But that's another topic, because we are involved with trying to bring together peace on this planet and peace in this universe. And in order to do that, we have been operating for 330 weeks, the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. And so that's presented every Tuesday, and it's very important to understand that event, because this is run by the members of the Universal Council. So we're trying to get on this plasma highway, but the reality is we're on the transmission highway. And in order to get there, we have to really investigate this transition highway, and that's what we're doing right now. And it's brought to light a lot of problems because many of the things that we have been taught and trained with involve our little MAGRAPH pie chart. And we wonder if the speed of light is the constant transmission. And is that a symbol of truth? And some say that the universe is only 70% hydrogen. And is this a thimble of truth? And where in this universe are you? Are you here or are you here? And is there an electron map that you can follow? So we have a very famous scientist, Richard Feynman, who talked about electron fixation. And the thing about it is that there's a theory of positrons put forward by Mr. Nambu. It says there's no creation nor annihilation, only a change of directions of moving particles from past to future or from future to past. So when did these two forces come together? And what happened when they came together? So we discussed the x-axis transmission, and now we're looking at the y-axis transition and how these forces come together and they create something. And that creation could be a point of conflict, or it could be a point of resolution, or it could be a point of containment. And we have choices. So the point of containment, of course, comes together due to the energy binding. And energy binding is very important. It's very self-serving, and being self-serving is very important. But when we were born, we created this binding energy in a self-serving manner, and we did this with the help of the universe. Somewhere along the way, since we were born, we learned how to do this at the expense of others. And of course, so that we can bind more energy at the expense of others, we lie, cheat, steal, and murder. And sometimes we do it illegally. And in the case of war, we do it legally. But the plasma rule, you have to remember the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. But this comes another point of conflict because that's not the way we think. We think in terms on this planet where the higher strength eats the weaker strength. But it has to do with this negative charge principle that we talked about. And so the direction of flow or the direction of binding energy has to do with the negative giving and the positive taking. So when it takes and gives from itself, then it's binding. But when it gives and takes from others, then it is flowing. And so this principle works in both ways. And today, though, we're going to just talk about the polar axis, which of course we've seen as the y-axis transition, and that references polarity, but we find that the x-axis also goes through a transition dimension. And so this may lead to a certain amount of confusion. We say, well, the x-axis dominates rotation and is part of transmission. But if we transition the dimension of the x-axis, we still carry the transmissions. So now if we do the transition dimension of the y-axis, it too facilitates transmission. So we have this anomaly between rotation and polarity. So when we think about the rotation of the planet, we think about day and night. But when we think about polarity, then we think about rotating around an axis. And then, of course, there's the North Pole, and then there's the magnetic North Pole. And so this becomes kind of confusing. But what we have to understand that this reference has to do with the medium, and our reference has to do with the message, because the message traverses over the medium. So when we look at the creation of the universe, we understand that it exists from energy. So, and the energy is always positive. So the charge is positive or negative, which reflects the motion. And if there's a direction of motion, that means it has to go to or come from another place. And so when we look at the cover of the structure of light, we see that the light is coming from one place and going to another place, which infers all things in combination. Are all these things in combination in the same dimension? Are these things that are in combination in the same energy strength? So this is the rationalization we have to come up with. But we do have gravitational confirmation insofar as we are on Earth. And so somehow the magnetical gravitational interaction of the Earth and the magnetical gravitational interaction of the Sun interacts and creates this inertia spectrum. And so the initial gravitational inertia spectrum was the hydrogen spectrum. And so when we look at the spectrum, what we see is the physical fingerprint in light of the hydrogen. And it's unique. And it's consistent. And as we've already said, it's consistent in at least 70% of the universe. I don't know what's in the other 30%, but, you know, hopefully we're going to find out. The point of the matter is that the principal matter, which is the energy from the universe, comes as an energy pack. And we all know what we do with a pack. We have to put it in a package, and that package is a parcel. So we have an energy pack and we have an energy parceling unit. And they're two separate things. So if you think of energy pack as the energy inside a battery and the energy parceling unit as the battery itself, then you know that you can hold the battery, but you cannot hold the energy. And this is the key characteristic of principal matter. We have to understand that the principal matter is ubiquitous in the universe. It is abundant, it is overflowing, it is all over the place, and it comes in a variety of different directions. And in order to come, it also has to have room. So in order to make that room, there has to be an emission of energy coming from that. And so we see that there are overlapping fields and the energy is coming into those fields. But how does it go into the different fields? And so there has to be a common denominator, doesn't it? So that the energy coming into one field is different from the energy coming into the other field. So it becomes a natural selection process. And all the fields get the energy because we have a point of containment, don't we? So regardless of which field, it gets its point of containment, it has its emission, and it has its absorption of energy. And so energy is always in motion. And because energy is always in motion, it is coming and going, which means it's a two-way street. So not only do we have two-way transmission, but we also have two-way transition. And so the relationship between the sun and the earth, although it doesn't seem to be very fair because the sun is so much bigger, but the operation is the same. The sun gives unconditionally and the earth takes, but the earth also gives, and it feeds back to the sun. And this feeding and feedback is an important characteristic. So today we're really going to be looking at the principal energy flow of the true two-way transmission and the two-way transition of the energy and motion on the blue planet. We're the blue planet because we are the water planet. But the interesting thing is that this energy flows around the planet. So we talked about these overlapping fields just now. So we have a physical field of the planet, and then we have the energy around the planet. And clearly, these are not at the same energy strength. And clearly, they are not in the same kind of physicality that we understand. Because as we said, we cannot hold on to the energy. We can only hold on to the parcel. So what we are looking at is the difference in the principal matter interaction of the rotation around the equator versus the rotation around the polar axis. And so the primary point of discussion is the polar interaction, because we all know about the equatorial interaction, right? Because wherever we are, we're on Earth somewhere. And some of us may be on the equator, and some of us may be farther north, and equally so, farther south. So this has an impact on us. But the universal solvent, of course, is water. And we talked about the gravitational conformation of hydrogen. Well, by adding the gravitational conformation of oxygen, we created water. And so the hydrogen being smaller is magnetical, and the oxygen being bigger is gravitational. But the water molecule is a maggrav and is round. So maggrav means it's a balance between the gravitational and magnetical field forces, but it doesn't seem to be very equal when the two tiny hydrogens are linked up with the big fat oxygen. So how does it maintain its circular roundness? So we have to understand relationships a little bit better. So what we're looking for is balance. And that is in a maggrav condition. But when it's in a maggrav perfect balance, then you can't see it. So the only time you can see it is when there's a difference in the magnetical gravitational relationship. However, there is a balance between the two. So scientifically speaking, we're talking about the conservation of magnetic fields versus the conservation of energy. But spiritually speaking, we're talking about the difference between the spirit and the soul, where the spirit is the motor of the soul. So this is where the plasma science comes in, because it brings these two different fields together and adds to that knowledge. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to add to this relationship. So this relationship deals with the conservation of energy, which means there's a difference between potential energy and kinetic energy. And the balance between the initial kinetic and potential energy is equal to the final kinetic and potential energy. But it doesn't tell you what is the level of that kinetic energy, or what is the level of that potential energy. All right? So we see that when we talk about the potentiation of strength, the extreme high energy is strong and the extreme low energy is weak. But there's all this energy in between that is subject to susceptibility. And so that's the difference between the magnetical and gravitational field strength. And so there are sequences, and all of these sequences are based on gravitational attraction, which is part of the feedback, and the magnetical repulsion, which is part of the feeding. And you, as the last man standing, have choices. This is not something that you can decline, or this is not something that you can abdicate or pass on to someone else. It's not my job. It's not my responsibility. You, as a Earth inhabitant have the capability of turning on and turning off the feeding, or increase or decreasing the strength. And as such, you will enhance or diminish the positioning. And so we understand the basic rule where the stronger feeds the weaker. And so this is not a condemnation of, you're stronger and you're weaker. This is just a reference. It has to do with sequence and orders. And since we're talking about sequence and orders, it just tells you how everything is very well organized. And so is that the opinion that we're carrying of this planet? Because this planet has captured fields. And so we have this x-axis transition, which is perpendicular to the ground, but we also have this y-axis transition, which is elevated above the ground. So what is the difference in this position? And that's what we're trying to figure out, because when we look at the different dimensions, we say the x-axis is the rotation around the equator, but the y-axis is the rotation around the poles. So when we look at the y-axis dimension is determined by polarity. But when we're looking at the motion as we see it, and the x-axis dimension, it's on the ground. So here's where the conflict sits. So what we're talking about is the y-axis transition. And so when you get a series of y-axes and how they transition, we can create this vertical wave transportation system that we discussed last week. So when we talk about the alignment of the planets, which was interesting, came up on this June the 3rd, and we've seen a bunch of the planets get into an alignment and say, well, what difference does that make? But understand that each one of these planets is on its own orbit. So really, they may be aligned, but they're all on their own orbit and they're all overlapping each other's orbit. And so is this alignment alphabetical? Well, it doesn't look like it. Is it sequential by number? Doesn't look like it. Is it by size? Oh, no, it definitely doesn't look like it. And then the question is, when you look at the alignment, it's whose point of view? So how can you see this alignment from this point of view? Because you're looking at it from the side. So you don't know really if they're all aligned in a straight line. They just seem to be aligned, right? If you could get in front of Jupiter there and look all the way to Saturn, would they all be in line? And for how long would they be in a line? But then there's the other question. The planets by position may be in a line, but are their poles aligned? Are all of them rotating around their polar axis the same way? So, well, of course they're not. So we're continually searching for outer space. And so what we're wondering is, to get on that plasma highway, do we get high on our pie in the sky? And we're trying to make this y-axis transition. Sometimes we wonder if we have to take time out for a coffee break, or maybe it's time for a jailbreak. For a lot, it's just time to get drunk and pass out, because it's not something that we want to know, because we're talking about balance. And so I ask you, did you ever lose your balance? And have you ever played that game where you stand on one leg? And how long can you stand on one leg? And if that's hard, what happens if you rotate? Do you get dizzy? Would you then have trouble standing on two legs? Maybe you would fall flat on your face. Isn't that kind of what happens when you lose the balance that's in your inner ear? And is your inner ear the thing that keeps you in balance? Is your inner ear a gyroscope? And wait a second. I thought we're rotating around an axis. So here's a gyroscope that is sitting on a pin, and the mass the big mass is rotating and it's sitting up top. How does it maintain its balance? So that kind of explains what happens when we play with spinning tops, isn't it? So we can see that the polar axis can be flipping. When we spin a top as a toy, we see that it wobbles. It kind of makes a clattering sound on the ground, and then all of a sudden it's spinning in a perpendicular angle. And it seems to always stand up vertically, kind of like the gyroscope, the big fat head at the top and the tiny pointy part at the bottom. So we've gone through this complete flip, and we discussed this in Earth Upheaval. But the point is that there's a physical spinning. Is that physical spinning what we're talking about when we talk about the polar axis? So when we set our compass, we find that the compass is always pointing north. That's kind of the international rule. But it's not that the compass is spinning, because if it was spinning, well, you wouldn't see which way it was pointing. So it's sitting still in your hand, and then of course the compass points north, so we know where the North Pole is. That's pretty good. But there's also a magnetic North Pole. And so really, the compass is pointing to the magnetic North Pole, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of the reality there. But that magnetic North Pole also wobbles. But is the magnetic North Pole wobbling, or is the vertical North Pole wobbling? Isn't that the wobble question? And then, of course, since it's rotating around the North Pole, it could be wobbling on one side, or it could be wobbling on the other side. It all depends at which point you're looking at. But seeing as the Earth is rotating at such a speed, so you really can't see the whole wobble individually. You have to look at the whole wobble together. So it becomes a big wobble. Wobble to the left plus the wobble to the right, and gives you the full wobble pie. And then, of course, there's the Earth's rotation, which you don't feel the wobble, because otherwise you would lose your balance, right? So you are sitting in your chair, you're listening to this broadcast, and you are balanced. And yet the Earth is rotating at a phenomenal speed. So there's a perpendicular interaction, isn't? So there's the rotation of the Earth, and then there's the rotation around the axis. And the relationship of the two have created this field. And so that field then becomes the point of confinement. It's not a point of conflict, because otherwise then there would be an explosion. So when we're looking at this wobble interaction, we see that there is actually a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere, and they rotate in opposite directions, right? But the Earth rotates only in one direction. But this wobbling can go from a vertical to a horizontal. And if it went the full way, that would be a 90-degree angle. So when we look at the planetary alignments, there are some planets that are rotating throughout this 90-degree arc. Each one's different. In fact, some of the planets rotate in the opposite direction. So when we look at the uniqueness of the Earth, we operate within about 11 degrees of a wobble between the North Pole and the magnetic pole. And so we don't seem to fall on our side. And yet when we go to sleep, that's exactly what we do. So we walk vertically and we sleep horizontally. That's assuming that we have all our faculties. So the point being is that there's a hemispheric rotation somehow that's in a plasmatic field, and then there's a physical rotation, obviously in the physical field, but the physical rotation rotates both hemispheres the same way. So whether you're in the northern hemisphere or whether you're in the southern hemisphere, east is east and west is west. The sun comes up in the east and sets in the west. So we're both rotating in the same direction, but plasmatically, the hemispheres are rotating in opposite directions and they're maintaining a balance. So when we're looking at this balance, we see that there's a dynamic plasma boundary that exceeds the physical boundary, right? So when we're looking at the inner space spectrum from the Earth space point of view, right, that's within the Earth space field. That's the physical Earth space field. And it constitutes an energy. But then there's a radiance field. And there's a feeding radiance and a feedback radiance. And that field extends beyond the Earth space field. It's a reflection of the inner space spectrum. So if we just look at the dynamic plasma relationship, as we said, there's a horizontal transition and a vertical transition. Horizontal transmission and a vertical transition. And that's from the Earth space point of view. But when you get on these dynamic plasma fields, there's motion. There's energy in motion. And the energy is going to and from. And so as that energy is coming out of the North Pole, and that energy then is emitting, from that point, it is emitting even more. And if it is emitting in order to maintain its dimension, it has to absorb. And so the energy is coming in and absorbing. If we look at the pathway that the International Space Station takes in relation to the Earth, it's kind of the pathway of a drunken sailor, isn't it? A little bit up, a little bit down, and maybe a little bit left and a little bit right. But you wonder, if we rotate in our orbit around the Earth, wouldn't it be a shorter distance to rotate in a straight line? And yet here we have this wave. So a little bit in the North Pole, a little bit in the South Pole. And if plasmatically speaking, the northern hemisphere rotates one way, the southern hemisphere rotates the opposite way, well, that may account for the upness and downness. That may contribute to the wave situation, and that may contribute to the balance that is necessary for the orbit of the space station. And so it creates this pattern. We have this wave, and it's a consistent wave, isn't it? It doesn't change. So when we look at light, we see that it does have a wavelength also. But if we change the wavelength, we change the color. And in the process of changing the color, we also have to change the frequency. So we just looked at the pathway of the International Space Station, and it doesn't change its wavelength. So therefore, it doesn't change its frequency. And of course, it doesn't change its color. But it does change its position. So we could say that the relationship of the wavelength to frequency is the color of the light, but the speed of light is constant, just as the orbit of the space station is constant and it provides a constant path, although in different pathways. So if we look at, doesn't matter where we are, if we were in Africa, we have the pathway coming from the north to the south. But on the other side of the world, the pathway is coming from the south to the north. So here we have two pictures of the same pathway from opposite sides of the world. One side is from the American continent, and one side is from the Australian continent. And so one pathway comes from the north to the south, and the other pathway comes from the south to the north. So we see that these are polar pathways. So on one side, it's a North Pole point of view. On the other side, it's a South Pole point of view. But from the Earth equator point of view, it's really the same. It's just that one is on the upside and one is on the downside. But, if you're looking at it from the South Pole point of view, so then one's on the upside and the other one's on the downside. So, the point of view matters with respect to polar pathways. So when we're looking at this dynamic plasma relationship, and we say that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. So the energy coming out of the North Pole is magnetical, which means the North Pole is negative. And energy coming into the South Pole is gravitational. So which means the South Pole is positive. But when you look at the pathway on the plasma side, on the outermost orbits, there's movement. So this energy that is on this path is magnetical. And so because the energy coming out of the North Pole is always magnetical, and like poles repel, so we have the magnetical on the one side, and there's the magnetical on the other side, right? Because they repel from each other. But then they keep moving along this pathway. So if they go all the way around to the South Pole, which makes sense because the magnetical would be attracted to the South Pole gravitational, except for one small little detail. The magnetical field on the other side is also coming in. How is it possible for the two magnetical particles that repel each other to suddenly attract each other? So they would have to become gravitational, wouldn't they? But if they were both gravitational, they would still be like poles and they would still repel. We seem to be creating more problems. And then, of course, what is the difference between the movement of the one magnetical particle to the other? Well, it has to be moving from the magnetical moves to the gravitational, because the gravitational is attraction. What causes the movement? We know that the energy is coming out of the North Pole and is basically ejected, right? It's repelled, it's emitted, and then it follows a path which goes beyond the physical realm of the planet. And then it has to keep moving. How can it keep moving? So there has to be a cosmic plasma relationship as well to take this into account. Because as it's moving, more energy has to keep coming in. And depending on the layer of the orbit around the Earth, will depend on the field strength of the absorption. But either way, if energy needs to be absorbed, the first thing is the energy needs to be released. Energy needs to be emitted. And so it's the emission and the absorption of the energy which creates this cosmic movement. But when we look at the space station and it is moving around the planet, it is orbiting the planet, it gives us the appearance that it is orbiting around the equator. But really, in reality, isn't it following the plasma fields? Because as it is orbiting around the planet, it is not firing its rockets. It is drifting, if you will, along the plasma fields. So the path that it chooses doesn't choose the rotating movement of the Earth, but rather chooses the field emissions of the North Pole. But once it gets to the North Pole, it then reverses and comes back. So then it is more affected by the South Pole. So now we understand that the whole concept where the North Pole is negative and the South Pole is positive is only half the picture. Because the energy flow is a two-way street. So there's a giving and there's a taking. So if the gravitational is giving to the magnetical, and that's in one direction, then the magnetical giving to the gravitational is in the opposite direction. So there is a polar flipping that goes on to change from magnetical to gravitational, and in that particular instant, it affects the movement. And if we can get that in a consistent manner, then we can follow the path the way that the International Space Station follows the path around the Earth. But just to make things a little bit more complicated, when we look at the relationship of the winds that are going around the planet, we see that there are differences, even though, let's say, the planet is physically rotating in one direction, but whether it's an easterly or a westerly determines the direction that it comes from. That is a sailor's rule. And then, of course, so we have polar easterlies, and interestingly enough, the polar easterlies and the north and the in the North Pole and the polar easterlies in the South Pole are both easterlies. And so there are northern westerlies and southern westerlies, and they go in the opposite direction. And then there are the northeasterly trade winds and the southeasterly trades. And right at the equator, where it is spinning, we have the trade winds, the doldrums. So the wind is going in all of these different directions, and there seems to be a relationship between the diameter of the equator and the diameter 30 degrees north and 60 degrees north and the polar. And that diameter changes. And this causes a problem as well. Because if the velocity is determined by the distance over time, multiplied by time, then clearly the diameter at the equator is wider than the diameter, say, at 60 degrees north. But people who live in the temperate zone between 30 degrees and 60 degrees are rotating at the same speed as those on the equator. But the distance they travel in terms of the rotation is less. So if the speed is the same and the time is the same, because the day in North America is the same as the day in South America, and it's the same as the day in Central America. So if the speed is the same and the time is the same, how can the distance be different? So this may be the factor that causes the difference in the wind speeds. It may be the factor that causes the difference in the wind direction. It may also be the factor in the curvature of the Earth. Because in order to reduce the distance, but maintain the speed at the same speed, then maybe the gravitational effect as we go north becomes tighter and tighter. So in other words, moving from the horizontal point at the equator to the vertical point of the poles creates a tightness in the rotation, where it becomes tighter and tighter, which causes the physical manifestation of that field to get smaller and smaller, which contributes to the curvature. So if we say that the orbit of the space station is actually following the energy pathways around the Earth and is not following the wind patterns and the wind pathways around the Earth, and so we can see that we have an energy path from the North Pole to the South Pole, and we also have one from the South Pole to the North Pole. And as we approach the pole, we have this tightening. So from the polar point of view, that the maximum energy is at the core. And once it gets into the core, and as it gets smaller and smaller, it gets tighter and tighter, we create this tube, this cylinder, this hollowness, this pathway. So when we talk about the pH, that's a perspective of hydrogen, isn't it? As we go from a healthy to an unhealthy state, from an alkaline to an acidic state, from a gravitational to a magnetical state. So, and all of the states in between have to do with susceptibility, right? So the pH of 7 is neutral. And the lowest pH is extremely acidic, and the highest pH is extremely alkaline. And of course, this has to do with the density, because we see that the acidic side is oily and the alkaline side is wet. And so oxygen is more dense than hydrogen. So the acidic side is hydrogen and the alkaline side is oxygen. But when we bring all these things together, the two flimsy hydrogens and the big fat oxygen, we get a pH of 7, very neutral. So the water on its own, when it's split, always totals 14. But the environmental conditions will change the pH. We've seen that. And so that's why we call it the potentiation of hydrogen. So, but the thing is, it's also the potentiation of oxygen. And so if we look at the creation of the water, it always totals 14, but we see in the neutral, it's only 7. Well, it's actually 7 overlapping 7, isn't it? Because when we break things up, let's say, for instance, we shear a hydrogen off of the water molecule, and that becomes positive, that leaves a negative hydroxyl. And both of them are looking for a position. And so we have crossovers, deflection, and twisting, which involves tightening, coiling, and tunneling. And so these are all energy packs. But you can't grab onto them because the energy is always in motion. So where's this energy parceling unit? Well, once it comes into its gravitational point, it forms either a hexagon or a pentagon, plus other shapes. But when we're looking at sugar and sugar energy as it is pertaining to humanity, we see that the hexagonal formation is gravitational, so it gives the energy, and the pentagonal formation is magnetical, it takes the energy. But then there's a twisting, and so the difference is this twisting motion. And the key component, of course, in the giving is the oxygen. That is why the physical condition requires an aerobic condition, oxygen loving. So when we did the cups of life and we found that there was a strength associated with the ganses, we had a nanocoating process. We created this monatomic structure in the copper. And we used the physical structure to make the cups of life, but we ended up getting all of these ganses. Carbon dioxide GANs, calcium GANs, zinc GANs, copper GANs. And then we find that there's an amino acid GANs and a water GANs. And now we've advanced We can even create a gold Gans. And these are all part of the radiance manifestation. The radiance manifestation, but they manifested themselves in the physicality. And so we had a physical first cup of emotion and a physical second cup of physicality. And then we found that the Earth space range details all involve a physical manifestation of an atomic structure. And each one's different. So somehow all of these structures were created on this rotating planet, which rotated physically, right? But we created different elements on the periodic table of elements. So if we go back to this pH table and we see it as a zipper, where when we split the water and it always totals 14, then we find that each of these is a potentiation layer, and it reflects the y-axis transition. So which is to say a pH of 6 will create a pH of 8, but a pH of 5 will create a pH of 9. While a pH of 10 will create a pH of 4. So in all cases, when you total up the pairs, they total up to 14. And so the question becomes, are they all in the same dimension? Are they all in the same energy level? So when we look at the motion, oh, look, this is how we move the car, right? The car is following this zipper transmission, right? Where the energy is emitted, and then it's absorbed, and then it's emitted, and then it's absorbed, and it follows the same pattern. Doesn't it follow the same pattern as the International Space Station and its orbiting pathway around this planet? And the only difference, of course, is that this car has a motor because it's on a lower energy level. So somehow, some way, we have this energy transition that goes along the y-axis, and some are stronger and some are weaker. But, if it's on a pH of 4, then we dictate a pH of 10. It's not going to be a pH of 9 unless there's some kind of intervention. So what we know is that there is a y-axis transition that goes from this gravitational format, which is your basic transmission, your x-axis transmission. But this is a lower x-axis. And somehow we get to this higher x-axis transmission, but that transmission has gaps. And in between these gaps are various transition zones. But in between these transition zones, there is a resting spot. And so two resting spots that we know is the monatomic structure of the nano-coated copper and the Gans structure of the copper Gans. And so what we don't know and can't see is what's above. However, if we look at the planetary rotation, which is physical, but this is ignored by the International Space Station, it follows the y-axis transition coming out of the North Pole to the South Pole, and then returning from the South Pole back to the North Pole. And if there is a change in the y-axis transition, that means that the closer we get to the extremities, which would be at the point of the equator, wouldn't it? Because that is the largest diameter around this Earth. Then at that point, the transition is the weakest. And as we move closer to neutral, the transition is the strongest. And so the emission coming out of the North Pole creates a field, a magnetical field around this planet coming back into the South Pole. But we now know that the reverse is true. The emission coming out of the South Pole comes back into the North Pole. So the fact of the matter is, though, that the emission is not the same in terms of strength. It can't be. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any motion. So when we look at the pinching of the Earth in terms of its radius and diameter going from the equator to the pole, in a horizontal way, we can see the same thing. We can see that the range from the North Pole to the South Pole is the longest. And basically, at the equator, all you have to do is take one step and you can cross the equator. So the y-axis transition at that point would be the smallest, the weakest. So this would be the maximum atomic physicality. And so isn't it interesting that the space station seems to avoid that? It just seems to cross over the equator. It doesn't travel along the equator. So last week we talked about the pH of motion. And so we find that our car direction was moving one way and the foreground objects were moving the other way. So as we deviated from the center point, and as we got farther and farther away, we got closer and closer to the extremes. But there was no accounting for the energy because the car had a motor, but the foreground objects didn't have a motor. So the balance of power was sitting elsewhere. And so when we look at the plasma shifts, we can see that there are different energy states. And, you know, we're in that hesitancy state, the lowest energy transfer state where we're using heat and electricity. But there are different energy states. There's nuclear physics, plasma physics, then it's dynamic plasma, and then there's interactive dynamic plasma and principal matter. And so there are energies that cause a plasma shift. And we didn't take those into account. But if we understand the pH of perspective, then we find that when something is near, it's more intense. It has a blue shift frequency. Oh, like the blue planet. And it's the source is gravitational. Well, that's the source from our point of view, our perspective. But when we look at the susceptibility of mass and volume, we find that it can be far, it can be less intense, counts for the redshift frequency, becomes more or less the destination, magnetical. So this gravitational confirmation with respect to our planet sees that the oxygen spectrum is key in this component. because the oxygen spectrum is unique in terms of the physical fingerprint of color, which is a combination of the magnetical gravitational field forces interacting with from the sun interacting with the magnetical gravitational field forces of the Earth. But not only, there are other things that are interacting. So when we're looking at the feedback summary of how we operate, we rely on sound, light, heat, pressure, the luster, the superficiality, laminar containment. All this has to do with the x-axis transmission, but there's a dimension transition. So we have this dominance of man-made range deviation. We say the conscious awareness overrides the unconscious awareness. But we've exposed the y-axis transition dimension. So the rotation actually becomes the polar y-axis transition form artifact. The rotation of this planet is a form artifact of energy and motion. And so this energy and motion gives you a transmission spectrum. And these spectrum orbitals are created by these non-visible viral conditions. It allows for the transition of visible transmission spectrums. And then you have spectrum to spectrum susceptibility, just like the unique fingerprint of hydrogen and the unique fingerprint of oxygen, and all the other elements on the periodic table of elements. And so we look at the superficiality of the surface and its luster, and we ignore the internal substance, the plasma substrate of the physicality. So wherever that point is a point of containment, but always one step beyond is the magnetical and gravitational influence. And as we can see, that it can change the waves. And even then, there's another step beyond. So when we're looking at the y-axis transition dimension, we have to understand that our communication antenna has to stay within this range transition, doesn't it? So the release of the binding energy has to precede the retrieval of the beneficial energy. The field release has to precede the field capture. The giving precedes the taking. The emission precedes the absorption. Motion cannot exist without coexistence, because motion is a product of existence. Motion and a coexistence reside in both matter states. So this physical dominant tuning that we're looking for is preceded by the plasma dominant tuning. So the range transition by nearness and proximity are the only way to measure, not distance. Otherwise, each of us would be rotating around this polar axis at a different speed. So we're definitely not man-space centric, and we're definitely not Earth space centric. We're possibly sun-space centric because the Earth rotates around the sun, but it's not conclusive. What is conclusive is that the containment is dimension centric, the proximity is dimension centric, and the nature of the pressure is dimension centric. And 3 transmission dimensions are working, but that's not the message. How is the message contained? So we find that we have to ask, which transmission dimension folding deviation are we referencing? So the accountability is both X and Y axis range transition centric. So when we're targeting our reality dimension between what we say is gravitational and magnetical and what we say is materialization and dematerialization, that point is someplace between that manifestation point on our Earth space and that transparency point, which is outer space. And that there's another place, some space, that is a balance between the magnetical gravitational field forces. So there's a matter plasma dimension that is physical and a matter plasma dimension that is plasmatic. We happen to be feedback dominant at this point because these two work in combination. There's a feeding and a feedback. We have conditioned ourselves to avoid the feeding. This is at our expense. So when we put up our antennas, we have to understand that the message involves a feeding and feedback manifestation. So it's the transmission tuning which allows the transition. In other words, if you select one, it is balanced by the force selection of another. So the resulting selections feed the manifestation. This selection manifestation is predetermined by choosing peace dome of intention. Yes, we have that much power. The range transition affects standard folding deviation. So if we're looking for balance, and the y-axis transition balance comes to and from the peace dome. So when we're talking about balance, the plasma balance, knowledge and wisdom can give you deeper insight, but the experience will change a man's perspective, won't it? So somehow, with that experience, misconduct must become harder to rationalize. So the pH balance actually becomes polar balance. So when we look at the pH of the mag-rab and we see that there are many points on the perspective scale. So when we look at the blue planet, we see that it is neutral. It is healthy. It's heaven on earth. We could say that the pH of the blue planet is neutral 7 on the pH scale. So emanating from this gravitational point, we could say that the pH of the North Pole has many points because there are many orbits around the planet, many layers. Think of onions, think of apples, think of oranges. They all have this pattern, and it manifests itself in physicality, doesn't it? The thing is, we have two poles. So when you have the pH of both poles, then you have many points on the polar scale. And they're constantly changing. So when we talk about the pH of peace, we see that on the wings of the dove, there are many points. And on this planet, each and every one of us is a point. So we're learning about the transmutation preparation process. And the 6th session is coming up this week, June 21st. The 6th in a series of 6. Well, we need to further advance the science. And so we're launching the space plasma research teams. Be a part of it. This is the new frontier. And as we are in the post-March 15th of 2024, current era of new selection process has come into play so that we understand our beautiful, bountiful Earth space in combination with that graceful space we call our inner space. which will lead us to our transmutation space, the real outer space, where we can share the greater oneness with all of us. And as we've tried to transcend the limitations of nuclear science 542 weeks in a row through the Knowledge Seekers workshops, understand that this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers who are learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There's a world peace treaty. It is fundamental for us to get into outer space. So sign it earnestly, sign it with intention, and sign it with love. You'll find that man is the reactor of a three-dimensional universe, and man can find heaven through the field transition. Can man go into outer space without a peace dome? It's hard. We're now mining the transition dimensions of truth, staying within the range of standard deviation of balance, accounting for the polar transition of the physical transmission dimensions. Plasma science needs to be delivered daily via the peace dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And that's the end of this lesson. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the trip.
Thank you, Alex. Again, have you just explained the rotation of the Earth that science has never been able to explain? Could you get a
Well,
Nobel Prize for this? I hope so.
I don't think so. I've explained it to myself.
Let's see if any of the participants has any questions they'd like to ask you first.
So, Mark, I have a question.
Yes.
Did you have fun on this trip?
No, I became more confused to an extent. You know, you said the giving precedes the taking. And you are in, I'm going to read from the transcript. You are in space as a plasma. You come across another plasma. This plasma needs, it sends, it's like has got the SOS on it. I need this field to survive. It's the field strength which emanates it, which creates for need. And you are the other plasma. You don't have physical dimension and shape, but as a field, you feel this I have, I don't need, or I have too much of as a higher strength that you give. Then you understand how it works in the scientific world in the coming time. So you're this other entity that has the SOS on it, it's not giving, or did it give so much that it now has a huge need? And so you said the giving precedes the taking, but with this plasma, it seems like it has an SOS on it. It just has a need to take a field or an energy. So does the giving always precede the taking, or has this plasma just given away so much that it shorted itself in a way? It says, I need this field to survive.
So you've answered the question with a question, or you've asked the question with a question. I don't know. I'm confused.
That's normal for me.
Yes, it is. So the point is that you are sending a signal. I need, right? So that's an emission. And the energy that you're sending with, you can't send a signal of something that you don't have. So the actual signal that you're sending is of what you do have.
Okay, that would make sense.
Really?
I think so.
You're so easy today.
Yeah, always. You talk about the universal solvent, but what if we go to a place that has no water? As he said, you can't go to the beach on this planet because, so what becomes the solvent there? Something in the dimension of energy, or are there any solvents in these other places where you said the water is the universal solvent? Maybe in this universe or in this solar system, but it doesn't exist in other places. So there must be another type of, if there is even a solvent.
So if we're talking about a universal solvent in our Earth space, not in the universe. The universal solvent of the universe seems to be the carbon 14. The carbon 14 seems to be the medium. So when we say medium, we're not saying medium small or medium large.
Mhm.
We're saying medium medium. Small is smaller, large is larger, but medium is medium, the midpoint. And from that midpoint, you can give and take.
Okay,
So
anyone? Yeah,
we find that the carbon is between, in terms of mass, between the oxygen and the hydrogen, isn't it? Anyway, did I answer your question?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I have these questions. I don't feel it's been answered, but it may have. I just have to raise my understanding up to that field level, perhaps to
Well,
understand it.
Mark, you just said if you go to another planet and the water is not there, then it cannot be a solvent, can it, on that planet? It doesn't.
It doesn't exist there.
In its, what we call it, not the periodic table of elements, but a table of molecules, if you will. Okay, because water is a molecule. So it doesn't exist in that regard. So it's the nature of the oxygen on this planet and its gravitational characteristic that makes it possible for life on this planet. So in that regard, it's a universal solvent, but it's a universal solvent contained on this planet. So if we wanted to maintain our conformity in another planet, then we would look for another planet that has a similar environment. Would you not agree?
Could you repeat that?
If we're looking for a planet that has a similar environment, then no.
Like here?
Yeah, then we can maintain our conformity as it is here. You could
Yeah,
maintain
if the inertia and the fields are the same or similar, you could maintain your conformity, but if they're different, probably not. And I
well,
think most of them
there.
are different.
Well, there you've answered the question. Okay, so from our point of view, and I think prior to getting involved with the plasma science, this was never a consideration, right? You say, well, there's no way for us to, go to Jupiter because that's a gaseous planet, right? And it is its environment is totally different from that of the Earth. Not to mention its gravitational field strength, right? So if we understand that the gravity seeks density, so we can understand that the the gravitational effect on Mercury would be different from the gravitational effect on Mars, right? So you have to get acclimatized to it, that or acclimated, as you were saying.
Yeah.
That the point being is you can get acclimated in the physicality, but if you don't have the oxygen to breathe and the water to drink, to at least provide you energy in that sustainable form, then you can't go within that conformity. You would have to change. And it hasn't come up in the past that it's possible for us to change, because all we know is our physicality, right? The physicality that we see in the mirror. So, and some of us don't like what we see in the mirror. So, we decorate ourselves. We, change our hairstyle, and we put on different fashion outfits. All that does is it changes our superficiality. It doesn't change our substance. And this is what the plasma science is. So the core value never changes, because the core value is founded and foundational, gravitational with respect to the soul. Your soul is you. Your soul is your friend. You are your own friend. You are the last man standing. So regardless of where you're standing, you're still there. And so this is the revelation of the new plasma science. So, how do you try and explain this to conventional science? And how do you explain this to newcomers to the science? And we have to understand that, what we're trying to do in these sessions is to um, distill all the knowledge into bite-sized pieces, if you will. But that's getting harder and harder to do. But the thing is that we all have this knowledge within us, because we were born with that, because we're all universal travelers in the universal sphere. So it's just that when we come to this planet, we choose, if you will, to forget, because we have this mental amnesia that comes about because of the way we remember in physicality, as opposed to the way we remember in our genetic structure.
Yeah, I'm so pleased that I started to understand a bit of this knowledge, and I didn't get immersed in the man's knowledge of the universe so much, even though I've read a little bit about it, but never considered the inertia, never considered the magnetical gravitational fields. Just thinking, I could go to any planet and maybe with a dome or with a shelter, I could live there. But again, you're still in the matter state of the whole affair. As he said on the moon, you stay in the dome structure, you never really experience the moon. You've limited yourself. So I'm very pleased that, I didn't absorb a lot of man's knowledge into this, and this probably left me with one less fight that I had to shake off that knowledge, which might have been even harder than accepting a new understanding, which to me feels correct, let's say.
Well, it definitely is a lot easier for you than it would be for a physicist.
100%, yeah. Especially one that's receiving grants.
And I have tried to do this, and I have succeeded in failing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's certainly very hard to give up the old ways in so many ways of understanding how things work, especially if you've taught it or written books about it or lectured, but on the lecture circuit, it's a very hard position to be in, to change what you've believed in. You may not have understood it, but you believed in it fully. So, and this is one of the problems science has with this. They don't want to rewrite the books. They don't want to perhaps go to a new understanding, a more advanced understanding of how the universe actually works.
Well,
As
you
a-
to
Yeah. Go ahead.
to give you an example of what you're talking about, because we're talking about the paradigm shift between the understanding between physicality and plasma science. How about the understanding between physical science and physical science? So I have a classic example because I was living in a farm, and the way we were heating the farm was with firewood. And we were going through a lot of firewood. And of course, it's expensive and it's
And it's a lot of work.
a lot of labor. Yes, a lot of labor. So uh, I had the benefit in my experience from water and ponds. And so I said, well, the first winter and my God, the temperature went down to minus 40 degrees. I found my endurance level at minus 35 was less than 5 minutes.
That's all, minus 40? Gosh, I can't imagine.
Well, just half an hour from me was a record minus 57. So but I can't believe, I can't imagine that. I don't want to imagine that. But what I did know was on the north side of the building, the temperature was minus 42 degrees, and on the south side of the building was minus 35. So, we spent a lot of time on the south side of the building. But, we had a sunroom, and that sunroom was obviously empty in the wintertime, but full of plants in the summertime, because we were growing plants. But the thing was that they were terrestrial plants. So after that horrible first winter, I decided that I wasn't going to do this anymore because I had a personal distaste for cutting firewood and carrying it. But anyway, so I decided to build a pond, and I built a 600-gallon pond. That's like over 2,400-liter pond. It was 5 meters long and 1 meter wide and half a meter deep. A lot of water, and I created a river so that there was flow. And the following winter, the temperature never went below 15 degrees Celsius positive, regardless of the temperature outside. Isn't that cool?
Where was this pond located?
I put it
Inside the structure?
inside the house,
Okay.
inside the sunroom at the front. And I built it in the summertime, so it maintained its room temperature. And regardless whether we burnt wood or whether we didn't burn wood, whether we went away for a couple of days and come back, the inside temperature never went below 15 degrees. Now, room temperature is about 21 degrees Celsius, so it was cool.
Not bad.
Yeah, not bad.
Extraordinary, actually, or
Yeah,
extraordinary.
well, real estate agents don't like it when you have, water structures in the house, okay, because, it has connotations of mold and high humidity and all this stuff. But, we actually use this water for our showers because the well wasn't in the best condition. So an extension to the pond was a settlement pond where the settlement that was in the sediment that was in the water settled to the bottom, and we just siphoned the water off to the top. And it gave us beautiful washing water. Anyway, after we moved out, um, the previous owner moved back in, and he was kind of amazed that we weren't using as much firewood. Let me put it to you this way: The firewood's measured in cords. We went through
Oh,
eight
yeah.
cords. We went through 8 cords of wood in the first winter. And in the second winter, we only went through 2, and he couldn't believe it. He couldn't. As a matter of fact, one winter he went through. He had to bring in more firewood in the middle of winter. Can you imagine? That's a real trick. So anyway, he just loved burning wood. And so, we reduced our wood consumption by 75%. So that was pretty amazing. And, we did that physically with a physical pond, right? So you'd think that would be easy to explain. When he moved in, the first thing that he did was he disassembled that pond.
Ooh,
So,
that gives me a backache.
well, guess what? The following winter, he had to burn a lot of firewood. So, I tried to explain to him in physicality, in physical science, why the purpose of the pond was, and I failed. So, you know, you they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, in this case, it was true, but you show, you build it, you show it, you demonstrate it, you realize the benefit of it, you realize the practicality of it, and still he comes in and disassembles it,
Yeah.
destroys it, and reverts back to the old system. And he's perfectly fine with it. And this is all done in the physical science. So when you have people like that, what hope is there to explain the plasma science to them? You basically say, well, there's no hope. So, if we're trying to do things on a physical basis, well, this is why there are world leaders out there who still don't get it. They don't get it that they are the leaders because the followers depend on them. And so that becomes their family, and their family should benefit from them being the leaders. And when their family suffers, they should understand that they need to change their course of action. And when they insist on not changing their course of action, if they insist on being belligerent, ignorant, and not seeing the reality, then we have to give up on the physical transmutation, if you will. We have to rely on the plasmatic transmutation, and then we can realize heaven on earth.
I was just thinking of that permanent candle. It sounds like you have some sort of effect like that, in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He said here in the around 3 hours, but lift and motion will be the primary show. I actually talked to one of my friends in Iran, said if they don't mind bringing a 1 meter, 20 by 1 meter, 60 Iranian handmade carpet, that we can put a system and then you can see what you call a flying carpet. It will be very interesting. Wow, I thought that part of it was he was talking about people covering up or something, but apparently there's going to be a number of flying carpets there, or at least carpets. We'll see what happens. He said, we'll bring a 20-meter handmade carpet that we can put a system, and then you see what you call a flying carpet. It will be very interesting. So there'll be, again, some revolutionary things. And he even talked about revitalizing that candle that was burning for centuries, one candle heating large amount of water and boiling it again. I guess it's been destroyed some time ago, but they may, during our stay, they may reignite what they call the public bath. It's a swimming pool they call it a public bath. With one candle, we can switch on and heat up a swimming pool. Any thoughts on that? What was the principle behind your pond? Absorbing from the earth? You said it was only a foot deep.
Gravity seeks density.
Gravity seeks density, which means,
Water's more dense than air.
okay, which means,
It retains heat longer.
okay. But I would think in a way that water would freeze up solid if it was quite low outside and there was no other heating source in the building? Or were you burning the wood and that was
The
taking,
pump was in
yeah.
the sunroom.
Okay.
So during the daytime, the usually there's sunlight in the daytime.
In the winter, there's not a lot. That's why these solar panels don't usually fare well without any sunshine, but perhaps it was just absorbing some fields. Very interesting. I hadn't heard that. Where did you come up with that method? You'd heard about it or read about it?
I did that for a living.
Okay. Wow. That's not too popularized, at least down in my neck of the woods. Haven't really heard of that.
Oh, there's some places, and I tell you a funny story. There was a lady that was looking at my plants and my ponds and stuff like that, and she was literally shaking. And I said, like, what's your problem? And she says, well, she says, I'm getting a new pond and I can't wait. And I said, what are you waiting for? And she says, well, I've been waiting for a pump. You know, we weren't so far away from the river, and I pointed to the river and I said, well, there's no pump in the river either. I said, why don't you just put the plants in your pond, and when you get the pump, then turn on the pump? And she said, so you mean I could start right away? I said, yes. I said, she started to really shake, and I said, boy, you've got pond fever bad. You ought to see it, man. It's when you get pond fever, it is totally irrational. But it's wonderful, you know, because it it brings vitality to the landscape.
Okay, anyone else have a thought or a question or a comment they'd like to bring up? Now, the soul on the top of the head, the fields go out and come back in through out of the north and back into the south. And this is why we have the structure built this way. But what about the plants? They seem to be quite successful in their what they're doing, but the soul is below the ground, but it works in the same method of out from the north and in from the south. I'm not sure I quite understand that.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, which play is the plant growing? It grows north. It grows vertically.
Yeah, there's so many things we haven't, at least I haven't considered in this whole run of plasma knowledge. There's quite a bit yet to unravel. Anyone else would like to come in with something? You're talking about the hemispheres rotating in opposite directions. That's new for me as well. I thought it was one sort of sphere rotating together. But I know Rick has showed those vortexes in the bathtub, and when they go in the same direction, they sort of slow each other down. They don't last as long, but when they're going in opposite directions, there seems to be a longer movement in a way. They sort of complement each other than working against. So maybe this is why you're saying the two hemispheres rotate in opposite directions.
It isn't why I'm saying it. That experiment is demonstrating in physicality what happens plasmatically. Because what Rick did was he rotated one hemisphere physically and then induced a rotation in the opposite direction. And that rotation in the opposite direction was equal and as forceful as the rotation that he was manifesting with a physical motor. So
well,
he was
with his hand, I think he just used his hand to create sort of a vortex there.
No, he actually he hooked it up to the tap and turned the tap on so that the vortex was created by the rushing water.
Okay. I know the video I saw, I think he used his hand on it. But regardless, yeah, you would think if they were spinning in the same direction, they'd actually work better together, but the opposite direction is actually, it keeps the vortex more in place. The same direction, they seem to cancel each other out. Okay, we're looking for a few questions from our participants, if anyone has any. Hopefully Randy's a little bit better, and Alenka, hope you're well as well. It's mentioned here in the chat.
Well, listen, everybody, I want to thank you very much for allowing me to continue to make these presentations. And I hope you've enjoyed them. And we'll look forward to carrying on this process.
Definitely, we've just begun. I think we're just scratching the surface, Alex. Especially with the multiple dimensions, we're just mastering, well, we've in a way mastered one, but we're just on our second dimension, this energy dimension. As I said, there's a number of other dimensions that we're not even familiar with yet. So there's a ways to go, but we contain it all within our structure. The whole creation of the universe, the RNA of the universe, the rest of it. So we have quite a, we never knew we were really walking around with all this universal knowledge within us that has been untapped so far to the majority of the inhabitants of this planet. And now it's being opened up slowly. Okay, if there's no further questions or comments, then I guess we can bring this meeting to a close. Hopefully you'll sign up for the next transmutation session. Again, we're trying to keep Keshe Foundation free for humanity, and we're going to play that 7-minute video when we conclude. And then the final disclaimer. But in the meantime, a way to test your own reactors and to play with them is to start using this understanding of Mitra, or the gift of the wise men, which is the thinking, speaking, and doing good, or acting good in so many ways. So I think this creates a huge amount of peace within you. It obviously keeps your blood pressure down, and by not taking and thinking good about a person, even if they've done wrong or you feel you've been slighted in so many ways, this offers a beautiful plasma shielding, I think. Not a lot can really attach to you when you're thinking, speaking, and acting good as much as possible. And of course, the other one, which is, may you be proud of the work you do. And this applies to all of us. This was given as a little memento, I think, in Manchester, to the participants there. And May you be proud of the work you do. May you be proud of the person you are, and may you be proud of the difference you make. So we're all carrying a very small corner of a very large carpet, and we may see some other carpets in the conference in Isfahan, as I
Mark, would
understand
you
it.
like to take the screen?
Oh, sorry, I didn't take the screen, did I? I'm just showing these images. Let's share the screen. Thank you. Didn't realize it, just went right into it. Okay, as I was saying, may you be proud of the work you do, the person you are, and the difference you make. And then, of course, apply the beautiful principle of these three wise men, which all the Christians missed, as I understand it. And this gives you a way to practice using or balancing out your own reactors within you and creating probably a good amount of peace, a good amount of wellness, because many of these emotional conditions, we think we loaned somebody $5 and I never forgot that the rest of my life, that the guy never paid me back and I still want the $5 back. So as Mr. Kesh said, rather than trying to get the $5 back, you just move on and make $15 and that'll settle that issue. But the thinking, speaking, and acting good is a huge shielding for all of us, but only you can practice that. I am not in your ship or in your vessel, but this is an ethos I think you will carry across the universe, not only on this planet. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yes, Mark, the balancing that you just talked about is
Yes.
not our responsibility is our own balance. It's not to balance the others, but
Oh, we have the ability to balance any field that we come in contact with, I believe, if
yes,
need be.
yes, but I'm just saying that we're not carrying the responsibility. We can just offer it unconditionally.
Right, right. What I do belongs to me, nobody else.
Well, what belongs to me is my responsibility.
Okay,
I
very,
I
very good.
I I can't assume your responsibility, but at the same time, I if I'm in a position to, I cannot allow delinquent actions, and this becomes the dilemma, the man's dilemma on how we approach this. So we see that there's two ways to do things, and one is physically dominant, one is plasmatically dominant, and one is by orders of magnitude more effective. So that's why
Absolutely.
investing the time and energy in bringing this forward, because that's where the future lies.
Okay, thank you all again for joining us today, and may you have an amazing rest of your day.